Hey, what's up, Jeff?
What's going on, Mark?
Nothing. This is gonna be interesting because we just reconnected after probably like 20 years, right? We grew up
Always
together with
fun. Yeah.
right, like high school, and then I probably haven't seen you like since college. And I was in Arizona. I was speaking at a conference. I was texting with you. I didn't realize it was you.
That's
I thought I was texting
classic.
with my cousin. Yeah, classic, right? I thought I was texting with my cousin, and then he's like, "Dude, I'm in the lobby," and I come down to the lobby, and like he's not there, but you're there. I'm like, what are you doing here? You're like, dude, we made plans. We're having dinner. And we had an awesome dinner and we got a
It
chance to
was.
catch up.
It was
And what and when we caught up, Jeff, what was crazy was again, time passes, we have families, we have lives, we have careers. Your career has fascinated me. And we walked all over kind of like Phoenix and we talked for hours. And I thought it would be awesome to have you on. You are doing some really, really amazing stuff right now. I'm going to set the stage. I'm going to set it up for listeners, and then we're just going to dig into it. You are an insanely smart dude. You're a lawyer by trade. You have been a lawyer for over,
fortunately, yes,
yes, and good looking. But you're a lawyer by trade, right? You did employment and workplace law for years. And as you say, how did you feel about your time in employment law and workplace law, Jeff?
and I should note I'm still doing that in part. So,
Okay.
but I'm much. It's a challenging gig. Just being a lawyer, I think in general, but in particular that type of work. So, I'm still doing it, but I definitely am doing some more stuff that interests me as well.
Right. And that's what we're really here to talk about today.
Yeah.
You blew my mind when I was like, so what are you up to now? And you basically, again, umbrella, you are working still within workplace law, but in the cannabis and in the psychedelic space, specifically on therapeutic use of psychedelics. And you're working at the state level in Arizona, you're working kind of in corporate level with companies. Tell folks, what do you do at a day job in this space right now? What are you working on?
Absolutely. So I was a lawyer for a long time, national law firm, working pretty hard. Pandemic was eye opening for a lot of people, and for lawyers, it was particularly hard because there was a lot of work for lawyers because a lot of uncertainty. But so post pandemic, I shifted smaller law firm, and over time, now I'm working largely with cannabis clients in the cannabis space, but then also with psychedelic clients, clients who are in the psychedelic space or hope to be in the psychedelic space. There's only limited options at this point, but the future is very bright. So I'm really in that space and at the local level, really making progress, working with people a lot smarter than me as well, to get potentially psychedelic therapeutic use here in Arizona, which we're starting to see throughout the country. So change this part of my practice is brand new, but I love every bit of it, and it takes me back to the good old days when we were spending time together, and it was so great to reconnect and talk about this. And I thought you might be interested in it, and so it was great to open that door.
100%, man. And for folks that don't know, right? I think even just bringing up the term psychedelics, when you think about the spectrum of people who are aware or unaware of what this means, the imagery of kind of like the 60s and the psychedelics and the acid test. And this is not really what we're talking about, right? We're talking about science has uncovered that there are therapeutic and medical uses for low dosing in some of these psychedelic drugs to really help folks like veterans coming back with PTSD, folks that suffer with lots of different mental health issues. So, what are you seeing right now? Maybe we could start here. What are the psychedelic uses? What are the things that people are using, and why are they using them? And then maybe we can get into kind of like why. Why does law get involved? What is the legality of this? What is the
So
work you're doing? So maybe first, like, what drugs are we talking about? What uses are we talking about that help people?
for sure. I mean, wide spectrum. And, what's interesting is when a lot of people are trying to compare cannabis and psychedelics. And of course, there are some comparisons, and there are a lot of medicinal uses of cannabis, as we know. But I think when we look at the two different, the major difference, I think, in large part, is how far ahead the medical research is on the use of psychedelics to treat a wide number of wide variety of medical conditions, PTSD being perhaps the most notable one that people talk about, but
Hmm.
really across the board. I mean, anti a lot of different treatments have been really successful for a number of different things. Resistant treatment depression, for example. And so when we're talking about psychedelics, your point's a good one. We hear so many psychedelics is a wide range of different groups, and we hear a lot of different things. Probably the most notable one, the one that people hear the most and that we talk about is mushrooms, or we like to get the term is psilocybin.
Okay.
And so that's a major one. And there's a lot of research out there right now on the use of mushrooms to treat. So, and that's really the first one that we're seeing grow.
Hmm.
And so, to your point, they're all unlawful at this point. The only really lawful one is ketamine, which is a synthetic that it's used for medical purposes in a lot of different contexts.
Hmm.
But now we're seeing it being used in the mental health context, and I think we're seeing a lot of progress there. But that's really the only lawful one. What we're seeing is at the state level, like we did with cannabis, because we're not seeing movement at the federal level yet. We're seeing states enact certain statutes that either decriminalize these drugs, but more so, I think the more positive ones we're seeing is like a Colorado and Oregon, where they're creating treatment centers where you could get these drugs
Yeah.
and for these mental health conditions.
And so with again, to back it up for folks, I always say lots of different people listen to this podcast, like the widest spectrum of professions, of knowledge, of backgrounds, etc. When we talk about the medical research happening, this is legitimate, science-based. Like, this is John Hopkins
This is
University. Tell me who's
John.
doing some of this stuff.
I'm glad you mentioned John Hopkins, because I don't know if you knew this. I think you do, but they have a center for the study of psychedelic use of psychedelics for a variety of different reasons. So, to your point, these are a number of legitimate institutions, both here and abroad, that have been looking into this for years. And what we're seeing is, and like certain other laws, we're seeing more progressive countries, or countries that are at least a little more forward thinking when it comes to drug policy, start to do this. And, like, for example, Canada has some limited therapeutic use, and I think Australia recently passed. So it's the research is out there. There's a significant amount of research throughout the country and internationally, and and again, I think it's really further along than cannabis was at this point in the game, which is,
Interesting.
yeah.
When you talk about like the medical research that's happening, right? I start to think of like clinical testing, right? Like, what is the dosage? What is the impact? What is the outcome of some sort of therapeutics? I'm curious, you'd said it's further along, right? But like, what does I guess maybe I'm thinking about is like, we hear a lot about like drugs that people take, you get at the pharmacy, that have really harmful side effects, right? Like the drugs that people take for anxiety and depression, they can have a wide range of negative side effects, but they might help, deal with depression. Do we have any data, any insights on kind of the impacts or outcomes or side effects of psychedelics like
Good
psilocybin or
question.
ketamine?
Awesome question. And I do, there are. And I mean, that research is growing. And I think when it comes to psilocybin in particular, I think there's more advanced research because, um, you know, places like John Hopkins have been doing this research. And I'm not a medical person, so that's I don't want to analyze the research. But what we've seen is there are less side effects, and really that for how I really turned and saw this was it was quite simple. LinkedIn on there a decent amount. I see it a lot, and what you see, and maybe again, if there is a silver lining from the pandemic, what I saw on LinkedIn was a willingness, a more openness, I think, from professionals of all walks of life to talk about mental wellness and mental well-being. And then having
Wow.
been connected to a lot of people in the cannabis space, I saw them, starting to talk about psychedelics as I really believe maybe more so than cannabis, those who are focused on psychedelics really view this from a mental health perspective. I mean, a lot of people, I think cannabis, and I do think cannabis helps a lot of people with that in that respect, and also pain. But I do think those who are looking closely at psychedelics and hoping to impact and change the law are really viewing this from the perspective of a psychedelic. I mean, of a mental health issue.
Yeah, it's interesting. I like how you framed that, which was like, we know, hopefully folks know that, like, it's very timely that we're having this conversation. I just interviewed on Friday a therapist. This guy is a school counselor at a high school in the Chicagoland area. He's a private therapist, not a counselor on the side. And all he talked about was mental health. And one thing he talked about, which was, he framed it beautifully, which was like, we've always kind of known about these ailments, these issues, these acute things that come up, these symptoms, if you'll call them, for folks dealing with mental health, right? And when you put some symptoms together, you package it and say, oh, when these symptoms present like this is a depression. This is anxiety. Oh, when you add in these things, this is what being bipolar means. So there's a scientific aspect, obviously, to it. And then that's like, we package it in these ways. And he talked about all these different therapies. He also mentioned, psychedelics as a really viable option for people. When you think about the fact that there is now medical research being done, and we talked about Johns Hopkins. There's lots of other universities doing this. You're working at the state level in Arizona. This is legitimate work. So one, I hope that this kind of takes away the stigma of like, oh, it's drug, right? It's like people say drugs, but it's like if you're taking a statin for cholesterol or you're taking Zoloft or whatever, like these are all drugs, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Right? So stigma, I think the point is a really big issue in this area. And here's what I will tell you from my experience. And to your point, it's overcoming that stigma. There is this perception, and you notice Timothy Leary, and I think it dates back to that, of psychedelics not being a great thing, and that going back to the 60s and 70s. Some people think those were great hairs, but a lot of people are, of course, scared by that. But with that said, what I've seen is pretty incredible, and I don't know if this is a nationwide trend. Arizona, I think, is an interesting state politically. We're sort of middle of the road. We're changing. What I saw, we made our first inroads in Arizona with respect to psychedelics very last legislative session, where there was a bill to provide state funding to research the use of psilocybin to treat veterans. And so it put aside some money for state funds for that, which is really incredible. It hasn't really gone beyond that. But what I did see was I went to attended a hearing where they talked about it from of a group of legislatures. And in Arizona, it's a bipartisan group, and it's more often than not, it's going to trend to the right. There was a veteran who spoke about his experiences and how really critical and life-changing the ability to use this medicine, and he referred to it as medicine, was.
Interesting.
And then a few other people spoke, and what was telling to me was then the committee voted on it, and it was unanimous. They voted to approve it unanimously. Didn't know who was on which side of the aisle, but a lot of the legislatures, including one Navajo legislature, who has said, this is when our warriors come back from war. First thing we do is give them plant medicine. And so she was, of course, very in favor of it. But many of the other legislators not only voted for it, but were pretty emphatic. So I do think, there is that stigma, but I think it's a stigma that slowly but surely, we're getting over as Americans. And I think it's really a critical one, because I think this could do so much good. In a time
it's
where
interesting because
such an
so we are seeing mental health is like just one of the most prominent issues that we need to help with, right, across the world, not just in the US. And it's interesting because when I think of again, the guy I spoke with last week, he was talking about how some of the the pharmaceutical drugs that they use to treat depression did not start off as antidepressants. They started off as drugs for other things. Maybe it was like a heart medication or whatever.
Sure.
And it's interesting because we have no problem as a society saying like, oh, the doctor gave me this pill, take the pill. Who cares that it started as like a hair loss pill or whatever?
Right.
Now it's like, oh, for depression. And the same thing kind of is true with these drugs, right? Like, I don't think, again, I don't know
Absolutely.
the history, but like when I
And
think about
to one
psychedelics, I think like, yeah, it was recreational and now it's medical, right?
and the one lawful one that you talked about that I noted earlier is ketamine is one that has again been used for pain and an anesthetic for years and years, and really now is being viewed and used in various modalities as a psychedelic to treat a number of mental health conditions, including PTSD. It's been found very effective with respect to treatment resistant depression. I mean, all, of course, patient specific and under the care of a doctor. But really,
Mm-hmm.
that is an example of a psychedelic that has sort of gone that path. But to your point,
Uh,
so that was one of the big hangups in that hearing that I noted was, are there side effects? You asked that question about side effects. And so there is some
yeah.
research on growing research. And of course, legalization and more use will provide only more research. But, I think what's out there suggests that the side effects are pretty nominal, particularly when, as you noted, even, those FDA approved drugs have certain side effects that people have to grapple with.
Do you get a sense now? Like, I'm kind of wondering, like, well, there's a few questions circulating. One is, maybe we could just jump in here. I remember reading that when cannabis became legal, that obviously it was more of like a liberal usage thing, and people on the liberal side of the political spectrum were like, "Let's go," and the
Yeah,
conservatives were like, I don't know." But then when you look at who actually got the licenses for the cannabis dispensaries and the growing, they were all like conservative,
so
kind of like shifted organizations. Like, they're making money. It's a big money generator. It's a tax revenue generator, and it helps people. So I guess, like, are we starting to see that the psychedelic research, the psychedelic medical industry, is it at a point? If it was a baby, is it an infant? Is it a toddler?
it's
Is it
an
not even
inf-
born
it's an
yet? Like, where is it in terms of growth as an industry?
psychedelics are really at its infancy and hampered by, of course, the fact that
Okay.
it's still largely unlawful in most states. I think they're optimistic, and the other thing, and I think we talked about this, is I attended the American Psychedelic Association conference in Denver last June, which I mean was my first, but certainly seemed like a coming out party for psychedelics. It was wide, I mean, huge attendance, like 12,000 people. And what I found incredible was,
Wow.
I mean, wide spectrum of people involved in psychedelics, from everything from the indigenous Native American, who obviously this is a big role and they've been doing this for years and this is important to them and they've been actively involved, and they should have a place. And one of the things that's interesting, one of the discussions is, how do we make sure that these groups have been using plant medicine for years are engaged in the process, and we're not taking from them, and so that's an interesting piece
Ah,
of
it's
this.
interesting.
But so you have those groups. I mean, I did see some, I would say, commercial, like private equity type of people there. But I would see the biggest group there was mental health, and which, again, to me, the practitioners, like the person that you interviewed, who recognize this is the future and could really help, and
Yeah.
other groups that are doing this. But again, what was interesting was, and of course, the most notable is Aaron Rodgers, who's very open about his use and how it's helped him. He was there, but a number of other celebrities, but also politicians, including some from the right, who recognize that this is the future and can help a lot of people, and some who view it as like a veterans' rights issue, and
Interesting.
yeah. So I thought it was fascinating and pretty exciting atmosphere. really, it was. People are excited, I think, about the future.
So if it's in its infancy state, metaphorically, it's in its infancy state, we're starting to see a groundswell of research, scientific research. We're starting to
Yeah,
see a groundswell of support coming from both the left and the right politically. We're seeing evidence of this taking legal action by getting funding at the state levels to actually provide research to say, is this something that should go forth? Is it a viable option for usage? I'm curious, again, from your perspective, because you sit at it from a legal perspective,
yeah.
what are some
Unfortunately,
of the biggest, what are some of these biggest challenges we're seeing? Is it a lack of funding, a lack of knowledge, a lack of support? Like, what will it take to get, maybe to go from an infancy stage to like a toddler stage?
you
What's
know,
going to make the
actually,
psychedelic industry move?
it's a wonderful question. The ultimate is some type of federal rescheduling. With the DEA, that would be the quickest route. It still doesn't seem like that's right around the corner. So to move it quickly, I think it's really just going to be. I do think it's going to happen a lot quicker. I think we're going to see at the state level. I know there's, in addition to Arizona, at least Missouri's looking at it. When I was at that psychedelic conference, I heard a legislator from Illinois talk. I don't know where they're in the process. So I think at the state level, what we'll see in the next year or two is a lot of movement. A lot of it's going to happen quick. It's going to be limited use. And I think what we saw with cannabis, of course, most of the states started medical, and then it opened the door to perhaps wider use.
Mm-hmm.
Know that psychedelics are going to have that, wider use. And that's why perhaps there's going to be a difference in the industry or not. Perhaps there will be a difference, because I think the thought is it's not intended to be recreational. What the thought is, it's really focused on medicinal. So, for example, one thing to keep in mind with I believe with both the Oregon and the Colorado that have legalized mushrooms to a certain extent, you're not getting, a package of mushrooms and going to hang out at your house, or it is monitored treatment in a treatment center. So that's
Oh,
the
okay.
first step. But I think over the course of time, maybe that loosens up a little bit, and there's changes as they see, both the effectiveness and the efficacy. One of the challenges, however, in light of that, is accessibility. Because if you're doing it that way, there's increased costs, and it's expensive to get a treatment such as that. So, are we really getting the treatment to the people who need it most, who might not have the financial ability? So there's a lot of, I think, questions, and
Yeah.
only time will tell.
On the legal side of things, what issues are like, what do you work on? What do you do? What kind of efforts are you undertaking at the legal level to kind of help this kind of movement grow? What kind of things are you doing? What do you see?
Absolutely. So again, at the psychedelic level, for psychedelics, the only lawful one is ketamine. So I help us with a ketamine clinic that I've been involved with, called Day Trip, that is here in Phoenix, and providing psychedelic assisted treatment to people. It's been
Can you
really
tell can you tell us real quick, like, what, for folks that don't know what ketamine is, or what
yeah.
that treatment looks like? Can you kind of tell us what that looks like? What it is,
Absolutely.
what it does?
So ketamine, it is a anesthetic. It's been around forever, but only recently have they recognized its value, and I think it treating mental health conditions. And so, and to your point, it's actually provided a number of different ways. There are some therapists who provide very low dose ketamine in and do talk therapy and along with ketamine. And then there's others, like the clinic that I have been involved with, Day Trip, where we do higher dose, where it's not talk therapy at the same time. It's fully monitored. There is
Mhm.
a medical intake prior to getting an appointment. And it's an hour-long process. One of the interesting things about ketamine compared to some of the other psychedelics, what I think is both useful and I think incredible, quite frankly, is
Mhm.
you're in and out in an hour, and you go through an experience. It could be, like many other psychedelics. I mean, it could be dark if you have some dark things in your past, but you're in and out of that experience in an hour. which, with mushrooms or some other types of psychedelics that can last hours, you don't really control
Hmm.
the length of the experience. But ketamine, and in this controlled environment, it's really an incredible experience that takes place over a short period of time. Recommended 3 treatments generally, and again, it depends on sort of what your objectives are, what you're thinking. Often coupled with therapy, so that you could really get the most out of the experience. But ketamine, there are a number of clinics. Some of those clinics focus more on pain than on the
Mm.
mental piece, where the groups that I work with are really focused on the mental health piece of it, much more than anything else. So
So,
that's
so ketamine is a very controlled. It, like you said, there's a medical intake. You go to a clinic, a licensed provider kind of distributes, or this medicine, this ketamine. You have a psychedelic experience. Again, this is like probably like from what I've researched, it sounds like it is a legitimate psychedelic experience. It is.
yeah,
You're kind of
absolutely.
sitting in a chair and you are.
There, yeah. So in our place, you're not you're in a very comfortable, beautiful, appointed, beautiful room, sort of
Yeah.
set and setting, as we know from psychedelics. Set and setting is really critical to your experience.
Okay.
So this day trip where I've affiliated with, they've gone out of their way to really make it an incredible experience, and it's really awesome. And it's, you're there for an hour, you're listening to music, you have an eye full blind, you're blinded,
Uh-huh.
and it's incredible. I've had the privilege of experiencing it, and it's a really deep, profound experience that is also very individual. So my
Hmm.
experience is probably very difficult. They're different than others, but for me, it was, I'm a lawyer. I'm constantly working and thinking. So relaxation of the mind is not always the easiest thing. For me, it was like a massage for me. So for me,
Wow.
it was an experience that I needed, and was perfect. But again, everybody sort of has a different experience. But that's the opportunity that's out there now. And like I said, like as one by one these states pass some form of legalization, we'll see more opportunities for people to have those experiences.
Where is that? You say, I know you said it's available in Arizona. Where
Yeah,
do you know where else this is available, like legally, where people can
yeah,
go
no.
and
Oh, so
seek therapy?
ketamine's lawfully, it's a federally scheduled. I mean, so you have to have a license, and it has to be by a provider. But there are clinics, provide throughout the country that do it. Again, some are focused more than pain than the mental therapy piece.
Mhm.
But they're out there, and I think it's a growing. We're seeing more and more of those.
Okay, so that's ketamine again. So, folks
Yes,
listening, ketamine, it is legal. It's been an anesthesia, I don't know what the word is. It's
aesthetic.
been
Yeah,
anesthesia for forever. Now we're seeing its use for kind of both pain and mental health. You go to a provider that is a medical intake. It is prescribed. You're kind of in and out in an hour where you have the psychedelic experience. It sounds like the protocol for that is dependent on the patient and the provider. If
correct.
it's like all in the psychedelic, or you said some people do low dosage ketamine coupled with talk therapy at the same time.
Absolutely,
Let's talk
absolutely.
about psilocybin, right?
Yeah.
People would
So
know this as
that
magic
was your
mushroom.
question.
Yeah.
I
Tell me
apologize.
about mushroom.
Yeah, so mushrooms again are unlawful under federal law. So what we're seeing is at the state level an incredible groundswell of laws really being proposed, recognizing that it could help a lot of people. So what we've seen thus far is Oregon and now Colorado. And then this year there's a number. And like I said, in Arizona, we have a proposed to set up these psilocybin treatment centers that will be regulated like the marijuana cannabis industry, regulated at the state level, because psilocybin is again federally unlawful. Everything's going to have to be done at the state level, like cannabis.
Okay.
So in Arizona, there is an effort, and just today, for example, a few hours after our call, I'm going to go to a legislative hearing where they're talking about the next step. In Arizona, the statute has passed the Arizona Senate, and now it's in the House. So there's a state House committee. I haven't gone to any of the hearings thus far this year,
Hmm.
but I went to a few last year, and it was, again, really incredible to see the support out there, both from the people who attended, because there are a lot of people who are highly invested, including last year there was this veteran who gave a very emotional speech about how this has changed his life, and recognizing he was giving that speech, recognizing that what he was saying was unlawful, but he thought it was so important to be
Wow.
out there and open and talking about it. I mean, again, not really a focus of prosecutors, mushrooms right now. From anecdotally, you don't hear a lot of prosecutions by law enforcement, either at the state or federal level. Doesn't mean it's still not unlawful. It's just not really a focus. And I think as
Hmm.
more and more laws pass, we'll see less of it. So it's being done at the state level. There's at least, I'm aware of two states that are really closely looking at it this legislative session: Arizona and Missouri. I'm sure there's others, and it's just being done at the state level, and it's really exciting. The other major psychedelic that I don't even know that we've mentioned yet, that really has the chance to have a really significant effect on people, and there is a lot of medical support and discussion about potentially even at the federal level, is MDMA, and the
Hmm.
impact, and potentially from a talk therapy perspective, MDMA and the just the openness that people have under MDMA. So there's a lot of talk about MDMA too.
Are those the big three right now?
Yes, I would say those are the major ones. Well, ketamine's lawful, but in terms of the two major, ones that we're talking about, fast tracking either at the state or federal level, it seems to be psilocybin and MDMA. There's a lot
Interesting.
of other talk. There's a lot of other psychedelics that we haven't even mentioned. Going back to Aaron Rodgers, the one that he talked about and is done a number of times is ayahuasca, which
Hmm.
is ancient, and that I know somebody here, a doctor who is a advanced practitioner, studied in Peru, and really knows that very well. But that's unlawful. Then we get into issues like religious freedom, because that is in South America, that ayahuasca is used for religious purposes. So there's a lot of moving
Interesting.
parts here. But the other area that we're seeing, I don't want to say take advantage, because they truly believe there are, and you may have heard a little bit about this, churches focused on psychedelics that are popping up, and really, and again, I'm not saying they're using it because they truly believe it, but view it as a
Hmm.
religious practice. The use of psychedelics is a religious practice. So here in the U.S., there are a number of churches that have popped up, and that
Interesting.
are say it's part of their religious practice, and then there's certain protections under the Constitution. Ultimately, they could be challenged, and so I think they're recognizing that risk. But again, they sincerely believe that's an issue.
Wow. I had a guy in the podcast. I mean, it was, I don't even know. It was maybe like episode like 13 or 14. A fitness guy, health and wellness
Yeah.
dude. And he had talked about how one of the biggest challenges is healthcare in the US, right?
Oh,
And he was like, if
absolutely.
we had a church and the church was the church of healthcare and we were all is being part of this church rather than going to church on Sunday or getting a
Yeah.
bar mitzvah, like whatever it is, you have to be part of this religion. The
Yeah.
religion would be focused around health and wellness, and then we would be able to get like access for X, Y, and Z under the umbrella that it is a religious organization. So it's interesting to hear you say that
No,
folks are looking at it
that's
that
a
way.
fascinating take on things. I mean, when you think about it, health and wellness should be the ultimate religion, right? That's the ultimate objective, and that's why I do think psychedelics. Again, going back to sort of how I started focusing on it, was what I was seeing on LinkedIn. I mean, LinkedIn, this combination
Unreal.
of people really openly talking about mental wellness and mental well-being on this professional website, and then not a whole lot of alternatives or beyond the traditional pharmaceutical that, obviously there's still a mental health crisis in America, so that is not tackling everything. And then to see again people really in the cannabis, it's largely started. What I saw, largely people in cannabis started to talk about it, and then I started to seeing that, and that's what got me involved. And I really think it's an opportunity that hopefully we don't miss.
I just have to bring it up, and it might sound naive. There's like been a lot of media and like Netflix stuff around the Sackler family, the Purdue Pharmaceutical, I believe. They produced OxyContin, and it was like this whole thing that I think the way it's all been produced has shown like, wow, they were producing basically like I think it's like heroin. OxyContin is basically heroin, and they were dishing it out to anybody and getting people addicted and things like that. I think it's just an important to note, again, when we think about who might be listening to this, if they've got that cynical eye, they may be like, you're just giving people drugs and we're advocating. I think it's important to note that when you talk about psilocybin or magic mushrooms in the medical use, and we talk about all these other psychedelics, I don't think we're advocating that we wildly give people these psychedelics, say, go to work. These are low dose. So in some cases, I believe that the research out of Johns Hopkins, that's kind of where the term microdosing came from, which is if this was the dose you would take to really have a hallucinogenic psychedelic experience, you're only taking this much just to kind of take the edge off, right?
Correct. And to your point,
it's not like it's like if you go out and get like crazy drunk with alcohol, we're not saying that. This is like, have a glass of wine, take the edge off, loosen up. That's kind of what these micro dosing is. Is that accurate?
I've heard of people who microdose where they take a very low dose capsule once every 2 weeks. I mean, very low dose, like incredibly low dose.
Okay, good to know. Okay.
But to your point, I think what we've seen, one of the things that I should note is a lot of the people that I know that are interested in the future of psychedelics and that I am involved with view this from the substance abuse. I have been in the substance abuse world and views this as perhaps a solution to some of those issues, in part. I mean, not the only solution,
interesting,
but really they think will help. And one of the things, to your point, unlike an OxyContin, the thought is, you don't need a lot. You don't need a lot. It's effective at very low doses. So pharmaceuticals aren't going to like that. Pharmaceuticals, as we saw from the Sacklers, it was, let's get them hooked and then buying more. So, pharmaceuticals are not going to like psychedelics. So there's always that concern that they're going to get involved and try to, the fear, the impact that psychedelics potentially could have on the pharmaceutical industry is going to be an interesting dynamic to watch.
Yeah, you hear about I think the way I've heard it phrased is like, if people get well, then they don't need the medicine. And there's a whole industry built on sick people. Like industries thrive on the fact that people unfortunately are sick, right? Correct. And so it's like, what is the goal? Is the goal to get people healthy and well, or is the goal to just keep industry alive? I think those things might be at odds.
From all the Sackler things, I mean, certainly the objective there, I think, was at least the portrayal.
The portrayal, right?
That it was not for the betterment of society. It would be the marketing and use of those products. But
so, since I think you've made it clear, again, folks listening, right? Like, aside from ketamine, psilocybin, and MDMA, these are illegal at the federal level. At the state level, there's starting to be some change and some work happening there. You talked about attending this conference, like some association of psychedelics. Are there major players? Are there major companies? Are there major institutions? Are there major groups that are kind of pushing this work and guiding this work forward?
That's a wonderful thought. A lot of it is not being done by major corporations, but what I will tell you, I think there's a lot of people who recognize. I mean, the other thing that we haven't even touched on is there's another group of people who are looking at psychedelics, the Elon Musk of the world. And there's been a lot of discussion of his use of psychedelics. and that's more so, I think, less. And I don't want to certainly talk for Elon, but I mean, I think he's talking, for mind expanding. In part, it might be for treatment, but mind expanding. So I do think private equity is also taking a look. There are groups out there, even though there's a limited segment that's currently lawful, that are starting to look at this as a potential, investment opportunity down the road. The other thing that's interesting is, again, places like Canada, it's lawful there. So there are a lot of Canadian companies who are, because they have more options, including some that I work with, they have more options and more opportunity because there is limited lawful use. Again, therapeutic, they could do more, and so they're a lot further ahead than we are down here. And so some of those companies are poised to really get ahead of the game when legalization at some level occurs.
When that happens, if that happens, and it sounds like this therapy is very beneficial to, and again, the science sounds like the science kind of speaks for itself, right? Less addictive, less side effects, amazing
correct.
outcomes for patients.
The one thing that I know, you noted Netflix, and that obviously the big one that I would recommend is, those who have any interest, is How to Change Your Mind, which was I believe 4-part Netflix series a few years ago, that addresses the future of psychedelics, how it's helped. It touches on a lot of the medical research that's already out there, and it breaks it down. Into each one of the series focuses on a different psychedelic. So it's really an interesting. What's it
called? How to Change Your Mind?
Yeah. And it's incredible.
How to Change Your Mind on Netflix.
Out there. There's a really great, and I should have prepared and had this information, but there's also a great one on Amazon Prime where there's this comedian who, sort of performance art, does all the psychedelics. And it's really an incredible,
interesting.
Including a ketamine treatment. But in addition, and he sort of talks about the balance. You don't want to do too much. It is supposed to be limited, and when limited use, it could really help you. Like anything else, in excess could be, detrimental. So it's another really good take on things. That's on Amazon Prime. I should have known the name, but so there's.
I'll put it in the show notes. So.
Yeah, there's really good resources out there.
Cool. I want to shift the conversation for a minute around we've talked about what are the therapies. We've talked about how they're distributed. We talked about the challenges legally that are facing at the federal and the state level. We talked about some of the work that is occurring. I'm curious, from a business perspective, you talked about some private equity starting to look at this. We see that there are actually companies, like you said, in Canada and other countries that are actually operational because it's decriminalized there. The playbook for going to market for psychedelic therapies, is it similar to the cannabis playbook? Does it follow a similar path? What do you think it looks like?
I think it's going to be very different. If the early indicators of what the system, and this could be, again, I think it's going to evolve, but certainly what we've seen from Oregon, Colorado, and what's being proposed here, and again, this is early stage, so it will expand, but certainly not the concept of you come in, you get it, and you go. I think it's going to be much more monitored. Yeah, certainly at this point in time, maybe it expands beyond that. I think there's probably some room for expansion, but I think it's going to be a little different.
That's kind of nice to hear, actually. One, I think there's a positive on the legalization of cannabis at the state level. I think, when you hear about things like the fentanyl crisis and fentanyl getting into drugs that kids might take, it's like, hey, if you're of age and you can go to a dispensary and this is tested and it's legal and you're assured what's in there, I think that's a good thing for people. What you're getting, right? You're not gonna go to the store and buy a steak and it's gonna have fentanyl in it, right? It's USDA approved. There's a system in place for checks. And what I'm hearing you say is for psychedelics and the benefits for mental health and for pain management and just for medical health is that this is much more of a medical trajectory, clinic-based, provider provided, rather than recreational. We're like, we're going to go to the store and buy some and go home and do it. And I think that's it sounds like a really, if somebody likes to plan, that's a good plan. That's a good way to be
Well,
safe.
and the one thing I should note, and it differs, I think Oregon and Colorado are a little more open, but the proposed legislation in here in Arizona, for example, is really focused on not just it's not it won't open the doors to the public. What it will do is open the doors to veterans, first responders, and other very specific groups. And again, the focus is those are the people, at least that we know, need this medicine. Whether or not other people need the medicine, I think time will tell, and whether or not they have access. But we know those groups need it, and they're not getting it. Some of them are recognizing that they, have to go beyond the law and look for it. And the one thing that I should note is, like pre-cannabis legalization, there are groups out there operating in the gray market already. I mean, I do think, as we've seen, I really over the last 2 years, there has been such a discussion about the use of psilocybin mushrooms, articles in various mushroom mommies, all sorts of discussions about, I think, the increased and popular use of mushrooms, to sort of, as you noted, like end of the day, take the edge off. Certainly at the micro, but that there are these companies operating in the gray that are providing this, and I think are poised, like when cannabis was becoming legal, to step from the gray to the to the regulated market at some point, and figuring out how to do
Interesting.
that. Yeah.
Well, there's a lot. It sounds like there's a lot happening. There's a lot to be done. Again, I think when you break it down, like, there's medical and scientific research that is occurring. There's practice in place already. There's the legal side of it, where, like you said, you're going to this hearing for psilocybin, kind of research. There's funding occurring at the state level. There's a lot happening. I think one thing I'm hoping to take away for folks that are listening to this is that start looking. If this is something that is all interesting to you, start doing your research. Start finding, again,
Absolutely.
I would say, is John Hopkins a good, like what should people
there is
do?
So much research out there. I do think, and it was widely recognized as really the top, and I can't think of his name, which is embarrassing, but How to Change Your Mind is really considered it was, I think, a significant moment for psychedelics, but it's incredibly well done. It really talks, for example, about, and this to me, we haven't even touched on this, but again, when we talk about demographics of people who are using psychedelics, of course, you're thinking young people. But the reality is, another thing that they talk about in How to Change Your Mind, and something that we're exploring, and I think is really critical, is for those facing, and there was a John Hopkins study, and the use, and how this helped them not only transition and grapple and deal with what they were facing. And so even at the ketamine assisted treatment center that I've been working with, we've been surprised by the demographics. There are a lot of older people who are recognizing, as they change, as their life, they go through these life phases and they start facing things like death, how things like psychedelics could help. So yes, educating yourself. There's a lot of great resources. Again, I think How to Change Your Mind is the top. But there is, and if you want to go, John Hopkins Center for Psychedelic Research, go straight to the source. I mean, they have a great website, a lot of information out there. There are a number. The American Psychedelic Association is another one. MAPS, which is really one of the leading psychedelic researchers, is a critical one, and they're the ones who put on the American Psychedelic Association conference. So there are a lot of great researches. Okay. And to your point, educate yourself. I mean, this could not only be something that might be you would want to consider, but I talked about legislation. There's a lot of legislative efforts, but at some point in time, if those legislative efforts don't work, like we saw with cannabis, there could be ballot initiatives where voters get to choose whether or not. So really understanding this, and because again, it could help a lot. If not you, it could help a lot of people, like veterans, first responders, who are going through some tough times and really could use, at least another option. And
excellent,
I know your work for veterans and with military families. I mean, as you know, it's such a critical critical thing.
It's most important. I always said, man, if you put on if you put on a uniform, first responder, veteran, military, you put on a uniform, you should be at the front of every line. You should get the best of the best of whatever you need, because without those men and women, we would not be
100%.
here. So
It
yeah,
should be
I
fortunate.
agree.
And
I
it's
would
not
agree.
yeah. So
Yeah. Well,
absolutely.
I want to thank you, man. I'm so happy we reconnected. I'm so happy we got to have this conversation. I want to, again, tell people again, if this is something interesting to you, go check out How to Change Your Mind on Netflix. If you want to see the scientific research, go to the Johns Hopkins Center for Psychedelic Research. Check out the actual data there and the summaries, the executive summaries there, and the briefs, and see what's happening. But most importantly, if this is at all interest to you, talk to a medical professional, find
Absolutely.
a provider. Let's not be buying stuff off street corners and testing
Correct.
this out. We want to be
Absolutely.
safe. We want to do it right, and you want to do it safely. Jeff, man, I am so grateful. I'm so
Oh,
happy.
no, thanks.
Dude, it puts a smile on my face just to see you and just see where your life has taken you and all the awesome work you're doing, man.
I was so excited talking about psychedelics that I didn't get to tell all the wonderful stories about you in high school, but we had a good time, and
Oh,
thanks for having
no,
me.
those don't
Brett.
make it on air. Those don't make it online. There's a reason we didn't have camera phones back then, right?
Exactly. Well,
Oh,
I
brother. Well, thank
appreciate
you
it, Mark.
so
You're doing
much,
great
man.
things. Yes. Thanks for
Thanks
having
so
me.
much, brother. You too. All right, man. Be safe. Thanks so much.
Thank you.